In this next segment of the video, I'm going to take a different approach to the depth of field, and I'm going to do the depth of field in Nuke. But in order to do this successfully, I'm going to need to render the character and the table separately from the background. Because if I don't do this, there'll be too many errors where there's overlapping surfaces, for example, where the head of the character overlaps with the background wall. So by rendering separate elements, you have a lot more control over your depth of field and you get much better results. The inevitable cost is that render times are going to increase substantially, but there's not much I can do about that. And in general, compositors would much prefer to have elements rendered separately just so they can control everything very finely in post. So the way to split things up is basically to separate foreground elements from background elements. And sometimes you might need several layers. For example, if I had a very prominent foreground element here in front of the table and the character, I would have to do a separate pass for that. But in this case, it's enough just to separate the table and the character from the rest of the scene. So the first thing I need to do is to define a group that the foreground elements are going to reside in. And I'm going to do this by creating a new group in the Groups panel and then using item masking in the shader tree in order to control how things get rendered. So I'm going to start off by pressing the spacebar just to make sure that all selections are dropped, because when you create a new group from selected items, you want to be careful that you haven't inadvertently got any shaders or any sort of random thing selected. And then I'm going to select the table in the 3D viewport and I'm going to go to my groups panel and I'm going to create new group from selected items, and then I'm just going to call it character pass. And then I'm going to return to my item list and I'm going to locate the character which is in this folder, and I'm going to double click on the folder to select everything. Then I'm going to return to the groups panel and I'm going to right click on my group and I'm going to select add items, and you can see that's added all of the items inside the character folder to the group. And the next thing to do is to create a folder in the shader tree. So I'm going to add a layer, group, and I'm going to item mask this group or folder to this group in the groups panel which I've just created. So on the properties for my shader tree folder where it says item, I'm going to select the character pass group which I've just created. And so by defining this group in the groups panel and item masking a shader tree folder to it, this is going to allow me to basically isolate elements from each other and also allow me to isolate render outputs. So having created my folder in the shader tree, the next thing I need to do is to actually put things inside it. So with my character pass folder selected, I'm going to go to add layer and I'm going to start with a shader. So I'm going to go to special shader. Now this shader should not control quality, so I'm going to untick control quality. What I want it to control is visibility. And the next thing to deal with is the render outputs. I'm going to need one set of render outputs for the background and one set of render outputs for the character. So what I'm going to do is I've got a group here with all my render outputs and I'm going to rename it to render outputs BG, and that's going to take care of the background for me. And I'm going to put these two render outputs that are outside of the group back into the group. And then I'm going to select all of the render outputs that are inside this group and right click and select duplicate. Basically copy all the render outputs, and I'm going to drag the copies into the character pass folder that we created earlier. Now in order to avoid confusion and just to ensure that all my outputs are correctly labeled, I'm just going to go through and rename all of these outputs with the suffix CHAR for character. So I'll just pause the video while I go through and do this. And having done that, I now need to create an override shader so that when the character is rendering, the background doesn't render. So I'm going to add another shader to my shader tree. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it down below the character pass. And what I also need to do is to drag my character's shading up above this shader because I don't want this to be overridden. And because the table is going to be rendered alongside the character, I also need to go and locate shading for the table, which is wooden tabletop and table legs, and drag those out above the override shader because they've got their own shaders inside these groups and I don't want those to be overridden. And next I'm going to go and look at the override shader. Now in this case, I am going to want it to compute shading and quality, because by controlling quality from this override shader, it means that I can basically override all the shading that's in the workshop group. It means that I can override all the shading rates that are set. In the items that aren't rendering, I don't really need a fine shading rate. And the purpose of this shader is basically to control visibility to the camera. When I'm rendering the character, I don't want the workshop to render, but I still need it to be visible to reflections and to GI. So what I need to do in this override shader is to untick visible to camera. But I still need to preserve all of the other qualities. For example, I still need it to cast and receive shadows so that the shadows are correctly cast on the table and the character. So I'm just going to rename my shader to override. And the next thing to do is basically to see if the setup all works. So I'm going to disable the group with my background passes, and I'm now going to unpause preview. And you can see as I unpause preview that I've successfully isolated the character from the background. And just to be certain that everything's as it should be, I'm also going to check the alpha channel. So if I select the alpha channel from the effect menu here, I should see that the character is indeed isolated. And the key to being able to isolate elements in this way comes from this group that we created in the groups panel and the corresponding item mask that we've got on this shader tree group here. And the fact that the render outputs are also inside this group means that all of these render outputs, including and especially the alpha, will be item masked to the character only. And now that I'm happy with the way everything is set up, I'm going to go to my pass groups and I'm going to click new, and I'm going to call it split passes. And I'm going to set a new pass and I'm going to call it BG pass. So in the pass for the background, I need to do a couple of things. First of all, I need the table to still be in the scene, but not visible to camera, but I need it to cast shadows and I need it to be visible to GI. The character himself I can actually hide. If his shadow was visible, then I'd need to actually just hide him to the camera, but in this case, I'm going to hide the geometry. So when I add things to passes, I use auto add, but I'm very careful to only enable auto add while I'm actually adding items and channels to passes. Otherwise, it's very easy to mess up your scene. So I'm going to enable auto add now, and I'm going to hide the geometry for the character. I'm going to hit apply to make sure that that's passed on to the render pass. And the next thing I need to do is to expand the group that the table and table legs are in and select both the shaders. And I'm going to make sure that neither is visible to camera. And I'm going to hit apply to make sure those channels get passed on as well. And now, just to check that everything's as it should be, I'm going to disable auto add and I'm going to unpause preview. And with preview updated, you can see that my table is hidden from camera but still casting shadows, which is exactly what I want. So now to create the character pass, I'm going to create a new pass, and this time I'm going to call it CH pass. And once again, I'm just going to collapse my shader tree to tidy everything up. And I'm going to turn auto add on. And in this pass, what I need to do is to disable the render outputs for the background, enable my character pass, and enable my shader override. And then I'll hit apply, disable auto add, and unpause preview. And as you can see in preview, my character pass is now correctly set up. Now in terms of render time, I expect the background pass to take roughly the same amount of time as the previous scene did when I rendered the character in the background pass, because it was the wooden floor which was actually the costliest item to render. But what I'm going to do now is do a still frame render of the character pass just to see what the render times are like. But just before I do that, I think there is one optimization I can do to this character pass. So I'm going to go to the render item, and in settings I'm going to reduce the ray threshold. So first of all, I'm going to activate auto add, and then I'm going to reduce the ray threshold back to its default value just for the character pass. So then I'll hit apply and turn off auto add, and now I'm ready to do my test render. And this is my completed test render, and it's taken 22 minutes to render the character in the table. And I anticipate the background pass is going to take about 40 minutes. So the two added together are going to be roughly an hour a frame, which is quite a long time, but unfortunately when you render things in separate passes, it's always going to take a little bit longer. So the next thing to do now is to render out the sequence and then take it into Nuke for compositing. So my passes have rendered out and I've brought them into Nuke, and I'm going to do a quick pre-comp in order to check how things look in terms of noise. So just add a quick merge node and then connect it up to the character pass. Just hit Shift X on my keyboard so that we can see the character. And then I'm going to add another merge node, and this time connect it up to the volumetric. Once again, I'm going to need to hit Shift X so the volumetric is visible. And I'm just going to do a quick preview frame cycle so that we can see it in motion. So the frame cycle is rendered, and I'm going to play it so we can have a look at the noise, and you can see that it looks really, really clean. The icy flickering that was in that corner is now completely concealed by the volume light. The remainder of the noise that was on the floor under the table, once again, is also completely concealed by the volumetric light. All of the reflections on the floor look really, really clean and stable. So the only thing to clean up is the Monte Carlo noise on the far wall. And I've already shown you how to do that. It's very, very simple. So this is basically now ready to go into compositing.